Welcome back to the breakout stage. So do you know what's better than a well-crafted, user-friendly platform? It's a secure, well-crafted, user-friendly platform, right? So we have a wonderful speaker that will introduce us to the wonderful world of NIS2, a thing that will, without any doubt, be a thing that will influence all of us a lot in the coming years. So we're so happy to have you, Cristian. Take it away.
Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Just to make sure, can everybody hear me? Excellent. So my name is Cristian Klein. I am the product owner of Velkin, which is a Kubernetes-based platform for organizations running software critical to our society, think schools, think healthcare, and so on, which not only distinguishes by itself by having very clear mapping between regulations and platform features, but it also has a really cute logo. The Arctic fox, which is, let's say, a symbol of resilience from where we're hiding, where we're in Sweden. I'm also a data protection officer, but just to be very clear, I don't identify as a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't identify as one. I identify as a platform engineer. So please respect that and don't offend me with further questions. And just for those of you who are unfamiliar with Elasticys, we're essentially a cloud-native shop in northern Sweden. We have also an office on the other side of the bridge in the greater Malmö area. And we're essentially building, operating, and supporting Velkin on various cloud providers, including on-prem. And then we're also providing some training and consultancy to help our customers in critical sectors of society succeed with Kubernetes. Okay, so at this point, you might be asking yourself, is this going to be one of those really boring talks with a lot of legalese? I'm afraid yes. I don't even have one single live demo, which I know that for the standards of this conference is rather poor. But hear me out just for this one slide, right? And if I still didn't convince you, then just go ahead and change tracks. So right now, NIS2 is going to influence us all. And right now, you have two choices. Like, choice number one is wait and see what kind of security policies your organization will shower down to you. The problem with that is that you risk implementing meaningless security measures, and you're really going to hate your job. Now, the other option is that you get involved and you influence the security policies that your organization will be drafting and end up implementing meaningful security policies. So again, people in the wait-and-see camp, this is the perfect moment for you to change track. I won't judge you. People in the get-involved camp, breathe in, breathe out, and stay focused. I'm really happy to see so many people that stayed, but to be very frank with you, that's not the usual attitude that I get from software engineers, right? Most of them see regulations and regulatory compliance almost like a swear word, right? I mean, they're running away from it like, oh, God. But I want to build a little bit of empathy just to make sure that you have the right tools to convince others of why this is so important. Now, I noticed that many of you are coming from all around Europe, but let me just say it, like in Scandinavia, healthcare is super digitized. You have one of those most private secrets in computers, like, for example, what kind of medicine you have and what kind of venereal disease you're having and stuff like that. So just ask yourself, how would you feel if your patient journal leaks and you had to pay ransom in order to protect your privacy and to not publish your patient journal on the internet? Or how would you feel if a developer at one of a healthcare provider just shows like, hey, check it out, kubectl exec, Postgres, something, I can change when you are going to have your appointment? Or how would you feel if, I don't know, you have a toothache and you're really not well and you cannot book an appointment for over 24 hours because, I don't know, the booking system is offline? If you think that this would be unacceptable, well, let me reassure you, you're not alone. So here are just a few screenshots that have been recently taken from the press about recent IT incidents. And I just want to put your focus on the top one. Society cares nowadays about information security so much that actually a CEO got a 3-month suspended sentence due to an incident. Yeah, thank you. I don't really deserve it, but yes, thank you, Finland, for doing that. So that's how important it is. So now you might wonder, like, okay, so why does this keep happening? I mean, some of you must have worked with security for like decades, if not multiple decades. Like, why haven't we just fixed security once and for all? And well, this is the slide that you will show to your CEO. The reason why this is happening is this plot, right, from 30,000 feet. The x-axis shows times, the y-axis shows investment, and we have been digitizing aspect of our life like crazy, right? This is why I could, for example, come to Denmark without printing anything on paper. And by the way, I roamed around this conference, and did any of you have some kind of paper to show when you check in? No. That's the power of digitization. Unfortunately, this other thing called information security has been lagging behind. And just to make sure we're on the same page, when I say information security, I not only mean confidentiality, but I also mean integrity, so making sure that, for example, my name is not misspelled, and availability, so making sure that, well, a DDoS attack doesn't take down the, I don't know, Danish metro system and I cannot buy tickets anymore. All of these three are part of information security. So why exactly is security hard? Why do we have this increasing gap between digitization and information security? Well, the way I see it, there are really two reasons for this. First of all is the funding gap. I don't know how many of you have felt like, wow, I mean, how often did anybody come to you and say like, wow, you have secured the Kubernetes cluster, thank you so much for doing that, right? That just doesn't happen. Like, did you get a cake for that? Did you get celebration? Not really. So security is currently really seen as an overhead and not as a feature. So which kind of means that market forces, they are just going to drive costs down, and which means that security is just chronically underfunded. But that being said, even organizations who have a generous security budget, if they don't have the right knowledge, then they might invest that in security measures which feel useful, but actually are not the relevant ones. And I mean, you have seen yesterday, for those of you who have seen yesterday the Cube Capture talk, I mean, you have seen how sad it is. I mean, you must have secured your Kubernetes cluster in so many different ways, and then the attacker only needs to find one gap, right? Oops, I forgot that were policies. And then they're in. So what is the EU NIS2 Directive? Well, it's first of all improvement on NIS1 Directive, duh. And notice that it's a directive, which means essentially that it needs to be implemented in national law by each EU member state, which means that there might be subtle differences, and each EU member state might add its own flavors on top of NIS2 and its own specialties. And I can get later into that a little bit. And from 30,000 feet, NIS2 is really both a stick and a carrot. So it is a carrot, it is a stick. It closes the funding gap. How does it do that? Well, very simply, it imposes penalties. Specifically, you can be fined up to 2% of your total annual turnover, or I forgot what is the limit. I think it was 10 million euros, whichever is higher, right? So you need a justification for a security budget. That is your justification for a security budget. But it also closes the knowledge gap, and it essentially creates something that I like to call a hierarchical DevSecOps loop. And I'm going to talk about this more later. Who needs to care about NIS2? Well, honestly, it kind of feels like everyone. So back in the days of NIS1, there was only, let's say, mostly energy, transportation, and banking were affected by this. Nowadays, NIS2 has added additional sectors such as public administration, such as space, such as research, such as manufacturing, because what do you know? It's not acceptable for grocery stores to go empty just because there was a DDoS attack. For some of you who are working for banks, you might not really have heard NIS2, but you might have heard DORA. Let me explain very quickly. So NIS2 is essentially an abstract class, and DORA is a bit like an instantiation of that abstract class, which has a few more methods, right? So this talk might be useful for you, but there are many more requirements that DORA puts on financial entities. But it's nevertheless useful to also keep NIS2 in mind. So it looks like all of us are going to work soon for regulated industries, except somebody I met yesterday at the party who is doing gym memberships. I think you won't have to worry about that. Now, before I dive into knowing what you need to know about NIS2, a small disclaimer. At least in Sweden, NIS2 is scheduled to be implemented on the 1st of January 2025. So technically, I cannot really tell you exactly what you have to do. However, I can paint you a very, very clear picture based on what has been done under NIS1, and also based on the proposal for a law in Sweden, which is called the cybersecurity law, supersäkerhetslagen, very, very fancy term. And I can paint you a pretty good picture based on that. But do notice that, don't hang me if on the 1st of January 2025 there are still some differences between what I told you today. So what exactly do you need to do? Well, on the very top, we have the NIS2 Directive. I'm illustrating this how the NIS1 Directive was implemented, and then you can kind of realize that this is how NIS2 is also going to be implemented. So on the very top, we have the NIS2 Directive, which is given by the European Union. Your parliament and your governor are going to propose some really fancy laws, like in Sweden, the cybersecurity law, which is honestly not adding a lot on top. It's pretty much just giving rule-making power to some kind of government agency, which then is, let's say, implementing the meat of the regulation. So in Sweden, this is called the MSB, the Civil Contingencies Agency. In Denmark, they actually will call this the Center for Cybersecurity, which kind of points a lot clearer to what that agency is supposed to do. And they will require you, so they will publish a few rules on the internet, right? In Sweden, these are called MSBFSs. And essentially, they will ask you to do 3 things. Well, first of all, to identify yourself. And this is as simple as it sounds, like just pick a contact person from your organization, usually your CISO, smoosh their name, their email address, and their phone number in a form. In Sweden, they will also ask you for your IP addresses because they allow themselves to make some passive scanning on your organization, and you're done, right? Then you have to actually take some security measures, and I'm going to talk about this more in a few slides. And finally, you're going to have to report certain types of incidents. And this is the scary part, which I'm also going to talk about soon. What's the point of this all? Well, as I said, it essentially establishes a hierarchical DevSecOps loop. I even put here 2 loops, just in case the analogy wasn't quite obvious. And what it basically means is that if your organization is an essential or important entity, then they will have to report incidents and near misses to your agency, to your regulating agency, and then they will forward some of these incidents and reports to the European Cybersecurity Agency, which for some reason, historical reason, is shortened ENISA. And then they will collect all of this information. They will try to kind of be like a brain which sees everything that is happening cybersecurity-wise in Europe. And then they will publish new security measures that need to be taken, and also some awareness reports so that you can better know, okay, what should you be looking for and what makes sense to secure and what doesn't make sense to secure. And so, like I said, the point is really to create a sort of a hierarchical DevSecOps loop, but kind of make sure that Europe-wide we're building the knowledge needed to properly secure our systems. Yeah, so let me talk about the first error in the DevSecOps loop, like the reporting incidents. Now, I understand that this is very scary because, this means that I cannot really sweep incidents on the carpet anymore, like I actually have to report them. Yes, because if you fail to report them, you're going to get an even bigger fine and your CEO is going to be in a huge trouble. So no, that option is excluded from the beginning. So what kind of incidents do you have to report? Well, your rulemaking body, so MSB or the Center of Cybersecurity in Denmark, is going to define very precisely what kind of incidents they care about for each industrial sector. I listed here out a few examples, but the documents that I have quoted these from are way bigger than that. So for example, if the ambulance service was somehow affected, it doesn't matter if it was just a health probe that went down a Kubernetes and the pod restarted after 5 seconds, you have to report that as an incident. On the other hand, if a patient journal system was down for more than 2 hours, that's report-worthy. Why is it okay for a patient journal to be down for 2 hours? Well, because there is another regulation that says that healthcare providers in Sweden need to have manual routines in place to tolerate an outage of 2 hours. And it's another example from transportation. For example, if 100 users or region of 10,000 square kilometers were affected for at least 1 hour, that's also a report-worthy incident. And notice that you need to report to send in these reports at quite a pace, right? So you're expected to send an initial report already 6 hours after the start of the incident. And then you have to send an interim report after 24 hours and a final properly drafted report after 4 weeks. So this is scary, and it's going to be new to quite a few of us. So how do we avoid having to file these kind of reports to begin with? And again, you cannot just sweep them under the carpet. Well, You do information security, yay! I'm going to get soon to some of the more Kubernetes. I'm going to get soon to the slides with fancy CNCF logos and everything like that. But before that, I need to explain you a few very important caveats for platform engineers. So the first caveat is that, strictly speaking, NIS2 sets requirements on information security management. So don't try to find in the NIS2 regulation how many etcd members you should use, or if you should use Kubernetes audit logs for 30 days or 60 days. They simply don't contain that answer, right? They set some regulations on information security management. So that means that somebody in your organization will have to approve certain policies. Hopefully they were drafted in collaboration with all of you and the application team and other people that are affected by this. And you will pretty much just end up implementing the policies that your organization has set up. And of course, you will be probably also heavily implemented in what is called evidence gathering, right? So think here about documentation, about screenshots, about reports like, hey, when did we do the REST disaster recovery training? Well, it was last month. Can you prove it somehow? Yes, here is the report. Here are the findings. Here's the scenario we tried, right? That's what I'm discussing, evidence. It's not enough to just say like LGTM closed. Then there is another caveat, which is special for platform engineering. So we are rather low in the tech stack, which means that we are not, let's say, directly affected by NIS2. Rather, the way it works is that the first thing you have to think about is what are the business security needs. So specifically, like, how bad is it if an information security breach has happened, right? So what happens if the data in this application leaks, or what happens if this application is unavailable? How bad is this for the business? And then based on that, you can set up application security needs, and then your platform hosting the applications, well, it needs to be as secure as to fulfill the security requirements of the application in the most need of security protection, right? So what the message I'm trying to send here is that it doesn't really make sense to talk about the platform being secure or not secure or less secure. It's more like, well, what data does it contain and how important is it, right? How important is the application on top and what kind of business process does that application support? So what I'm trying to convey here is, let me just exemplify this. So if your Kubernetes cluster is honestly just hosting, I don't know, the internal cafeteria menu, then no, you cannot really run it replicated across 3 data centers, just in case. Because yes, people are going to be upset if that internal cafeteria menu is unavailable, but honestly, nobody's really going to suffer because of that, right? The business is far from being in danger. On the other hand, if your Kubernetes service is somehow hosting an application which is necessary for ambulance service, oh God, then maybe do have 5 etcd members spread across 5 data centers because you definitely don't want that thing to go down. Okay, so let me now start to get more into what you actually need to do information security. And how many of you are familiar with risk management? Okay, so quite a few of you. I'm going to then fly a little bit faster through this, to the parts where are more applicable to the platform engineering. So essentially risk management means like brainstorm on things that can go wrong, assess how bad they are, and then you can essentially decide, well, do I accept the risk, which is a fancy word to say don't do anything about it, but I even put it in capital letters, document the decision because you will be hung over why did you not do anything. The other possibility is just to transfer the risk, so essentially make it somebody else's problems. This is what happens if you're having for example, a managed service provider for your Kubernetes cluster, which is ISO 27000 certified. In that case, you're essentially transferring some of the risks over to them. Or you can mitigate those risks, which essentially means do something about them. And NIS2 wants you to think about 3 kind of measures you can do. So it's technical measures, operational measures, and organizational measures. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with risk management or who haven't applied this methodology at the platform level, this might be a bit complicated and confusing. So let me try to illustrate this with a few examples. So you generally start from a threat. For example, what do you know? Data centers can burn down, right? Fire is a threat. Where do you get these threats from? Well, the best source will be the NIST threat landscape. They publish like a yearly report of what they see are the biggest threats right now for information security. How do they know this stuff? Well, you remember that they get all of those near misses and incident report, so they have a pretty good picture of what's going on Europe-wide. And I just put here a bit of a screenshot from what they see as the biggest problems right now, and it seems like ransomware attacks are the biggest concern, malware are the biggest concern, social engineering, right? So not so much about Kubernetes clusters being not properly secured. Then again, ransomware attacks, that feels something that you can definitely, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, like that can be addressed from the platform level. Another good source for threads is ISO 27005. And my favorite source for threads is just simply reading the news, right? So that's why I like to hang out on LinkedIn, and that's why I follow so many people, because I kind of want to be aware of the shit that is happening out there so that hopefully I can prevent it before it affects me. So once you have identified a thread, you're wondering like, okay, so if this happens to us, what can happen? And let's say that one of the risks with this thread is that, well, the application can go down. Currently, it's hosted in one single data center. We're running on-prem. I don't know, application goes down. Okay, how bad is this? Well, strictly speaking, data centers don't burn down that often. Like maybe I have seen one report a year or something like that. And also we have good procedures for disaster recovery in place. So honestly, this is not such a big deal, right? So in that case, we're just going to accept the risk. But again, and I need to highlight this, this is not sweeping the problem on the carpet. You actually have to put a lot of effort into documenting that you have did the analysis, that you have decided that it's okay, that the right people were part of that, right, with their knowledge to make sure that it's okay to do it, and that you had the proper sign-offs. So maybe you don't even have the authority to sign off and accept such a risk. But you know what? This is where things are really great, because in case your CEO or your CISO has to sign off this particular risk, that really aligns what's important to the management team and what's important to platform engineering. So, okay, you don't want me to, I don't know, scale up the Kubernetes cluster to have so many, let's say that you're running on-prem. You don't want us to go from a single data center to a cross data center stretch cluster. That's fine, we agree on that. And then when next time an incident happens because of that, I can just show you the document that you said it's okay to do that, so all fine. Let's take now a different, perhaps scarier and more dramatic example. And since we're in Denmark, I woke up one day and checked my LinkedIn feed, and the news said a Danish cloud host says customer lost all data. I mean, they lost all customer data after a ransomware attack. This happened last year in August. I felt really sorry for those people, but right afterwards, I also felt super scared, because I thought like, oh my God, if this happened to us and we started to lose the backups, we would be it would be panic, right? So, okay, ransomware attacks against the infrastructure providers don't succeed that often, so the likelihood is low, but you know, the idea that you cannot recover to a known state, like you don't have any way out, that's very scary. So I would say severity is really high. So we need to do something about it. We need to mitigate it. Let's do off-cloud backups, right? This is one of the buzzwords that we have. Like, let's have a second cloud provider to which we are replicating and encrypting the backups just to make sure that we have a way out no matter what happens. And here is where things are getting very interesting, and where I think finally we're getting to the part which is relevant to this particular conference. Your organization has two choices at this point. Either you let each application team deal with how to do off-cloud backups, and then you end up with a plethora of implementations which need to be maintained, which are rather incompatible, which need to be tested, and so on. Or you save your organization money, and you implement this requirement at the platform level with open source tools such as rclone and Velero. You solve it once for all your application teams. They don't have to worry about it. You only test this implementation once, and voila, you moved on. I'm going to leave this slide a few more seconds just to make sure that it impregnates on your retina, because this is really the most important part of my talk. Like, you have the potential to save your boss money. That is how you convince them to play with cool cloud-native tech. Okay, let's take another example. So, human error. You know, humans are beautiful builders of applications, but they also mess things up. What can you do about what can happen because of that? Well, somebody, you know, just quickly pushed a change on a Friday evening, and due to that, the application went down due to fat fingers during a maintenance. Honestly, this happens quite often if you don't have any safeguards in place, and it's also pretty bad, right, if it happens at the wrong moment. So let's decide we want to mitigate this particular risk. And remember, NIS2 doesn't want you only to think about technical measures, right? So a technical measure would be, for example, well, just use Open Policy Agent or Kyverno, like we saw in the talk just today, to make sure that they don't do stuff like using the latest tag or make sure that they have replication too or whatnot. And these are really good technical measures to avoid this kind of risk. But they also, NIS2 also wants you to think about operational and organizational measures. So an easy operational measure that you can take is like, yeah, do have 2 separate Kubernetes clusters, because if you need to upgrade the ingress controller or are doing, I don't know, some kind of change like that, you really cannot test that change directly in production without messing things up. You really need a staging Kubernetes cluster to try that out. And then an organizational measure would be like, well, instead of us just enforcing policies like crazy, maybe it's time to also talk a little bit to the application developers and properly onboard them, maybe even force them through a certification such as the Certified Kubernetes Application Developers to make sure that they understand this stuff and they don't work against those policies, but they work with those policies as code. All right. So we need to ask you for risk management, but this is not the only thing. They also have something which is called the 10 minimum requirements, which I find particularly satisfying because it almost sounds like the 10 commandments. So not all of these make sense for platform engineers. I mean, yes, do remind people not to click on links in random emails that they get, but that's really not something that we're doing as platform engineers. However, there are 7 other requirements that can be very nicely fulfilled with CNCF projects. And again, you are potentially reducing the compliance burden of your organization. ENISA published a 155 pages report on what exactly these things mean. I actually read it, so I could entertain you the whole day about these. But for the sake of time, let me just fly quickly through it. So for incident handling, you can use things such as Fluentd and Prometheus to properly understand if incidents have happened and where exactly the incident had happened, what's the cause of it, and how to remediate it. Backup management, disaster recovery, well, that's Rclone and Velero. I've already talked about this. For network security, as we saw yesterday in Kube Capture, do have proper network, Kubernetes network policies. And maybe do use an OPA or a Kyverno rule to make sure that people don't forget adding network policies. But do also train them on how to write the right network policy, not just, allow all, I'm done. For vulnerability management, you can use projects such as Aqua Tri-V, either scanning the cluster directly or maybe in the container registry. Now, requirement number 7 technically says basic cybersecurity hygiene and training, but maybe you can squeeze in here your certified Kubernetes security specialist training. Maybe. It's not really a one-to-one mapping, but try it out. Use of cryptography and encryption, that's Cert Manager. Access control, well, do have proper Kubernetes RBACs. And then for some reason, they squeezed in multi-factor authentication in NIS2 regulations. So yeah, do enable 2-factor authentication in your identity provider, and then use DEX. You do use DEX, right? And not cluster admin permissions to everyone. Yeah. Anyway, so do use DEX and enable 2-factor authentication in your identity provider to also fulfill that requirement. Now, you might wonder, why did I call those things minimum requirements? And as I said before, it's because every single country in Europe may add requirements on top of them, right, to add their own flavor to it. I'm going to give you an example of how this could look like from a regulation we have in Sweden, which is from the NIS1 era and applies to public administration. So they're very clear that they want you to separate non-production from production environments. They're very clear that they want you to separate admin from non-admin access, even if you're the same person. So yes, you should really have 2 accounts, one for admin access and one for non-admin access, even though you happen to be the same person. They ask you to do proper change management, and they ask you to have tamper-proof backups, which I think is really useful advice. So how do we do this as platform engineers? Well, in my opinion, like I said, you sometimes need to upgrade platform components. So cluster, it doesn't really make sense to have production, non-production environments on the same cluster. So I recommend you to use cluster isolation and have separate Kubernetes cluster for production. Then do use OpenID and proper Kubernetes RBAC. Enforce a no latest tag to make sure change management works properly. And then, as I have championed so many times, do use Rclone to a bucket with object locking, because this means that you just set a nice compliance rule there, 30 days, and not even you can remove that object from there. Now, I couldn't really finish my presentation without sending out some kudos to the German regulation, the Bundesschutzinstitut, who has come up with, they have like an IT, like a compendium of security best practices. And one of them is actually about Kubernetes, where they give you very useful tips such as do have network policies and don't use the default service account and have liveliness and readiness and startup probes. Now, on one hand, I'm really happy that they started the conversation back in 2022. But if anyone knows them, then please tell them that I'm a little bit disappointed that they didn't continue this conversation, because honestly, there are some improvements that I feel they could have done. But nevertheless, happy that they started the conversation. Yeah, so to sum up, if you work with software, you will be affected by NIS2. NIS2 essentially plugs the security funding gap and the knowledge gap. And my main takeaway is that you can influence the security measures which you have to implement, and you can help your organization actually reduce compliance burden, save your boss money by playing with cool cloud-native technology. And with that being said, I put some resources here, my slides, in case you want to read more about this. And if you like my talk, I post regularly on LinkedIn on similar topics at the intersection of Kubernetes and data protection regulations. And with that being said, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
So where should I run to? Any questions? Oh, there's one.
Cardio for you. Thanks a lot. It was very interesting to hear how governments affect our life. I have a question because you said you read, what was it, 700 pages?
Yeah, so the ENISA implementation guidelines are 155 pages long.
Does it touch upon open source, bugs in open source software that can be exploited that are not even known, to the point that like you have an incident because there is a bug in open source software that hasn't been patched, has not been identified, and then what, do I have a file report for that as well? Or how does it work? And with whom lies the responsibility according to this legislation? So if I use Cilium, for example, and my network got hacked because of a bug in Cilium, who is responsible here, Cilium or me, the open source project? And what do I report then?
Yeah, so this is going to be a very interesting conversation, and Cilium salespeople will love to hear that. Because you see item number 4 for supply chain security, that essentially means that you are ultimately responsible for your business and your application run properly. So either you take the risk that, hey, we're good enough at Cilium, we have vetted enough Cilium, we know that Cilium is a good product, it's used by 1 million people, so the likelihood of such a bug interfering is very small, and you just accept the risk. Or you actually sign a contract with Cilium and say like, hey, in exchange for you taking over this responsibility, we're willing to exchange money with you. And this regulation might, I don't want to here talk about open source strategies, which I think we had in one talk today, but this might make it a little bit more likely that developers are actually going to be paid for their contribution, and you cannot just use some kind of open source project which is maintained by some kind of dude or woman over the weekends, but that you'll have to make sure that the software that you're using has some kind of agreement in place to make sure that it doesn't just get unmaintained, or it doesn't contain bugs, or that those security bugs get fixed on time. So I haven't really put this because I felt like that's more like for lawyers and people who sign contracts to figure out. But essentially, yes, you will have to clarify who is responsible for that by signing a very clear contract. You may accept, and like I said, you may accept the risk. You may say like, hey, Cilium is an amazing product. We don't need to sign a contract. But I increasingly hear people like, no, we actually want to pay Cilium to make sure that they do proper vulnerability management, they fix all of those bugs, and so on.
So we are actually out of time. I know that you all have questions queued up, but good news is that you can come down, find Cristian, and have a chat. Other good news is that in 1 minute there's, okay, so I'm not setting you up for success here. In 1 minute there's cake. And there will be one last session here in the breakout room in 15 minutes. So have fun, and thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you.
Your box.